Hello everyone, today we have Associate Professor Tilman on the Eternal Possibilities show. For those of you who don't know, Associate Professor Tilman is a public health and infectious diseases physician who has devoted much of his professional life to eliminating nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. This work has earned the organization that he's founded, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, the Nobel Peace Prize just recently in 2017. Originally, Dr. Tilman was a Monash Medical School graduate. He's led a broad career in travel medicine, leading him to be an international medical advisor to the Australian Red Cross for more than 20 years, among other posts. Welcome, Dr. Tilman to the Eternal Possibilities show.
Thank you very much, Jefferson.
I think originally the first piece of advocacy that I could find was when you were 15 years old and you had formed the Amnesty International group at your school. And the story goes that you walked into the Melbourne offices of the Greek Herald and urged the editor there to report on the injustices of a young man that was imprisoned in Greece for writing a political slogan on the wall. And that ended up working. That Greek youth was freed, and you got a letter from their parents expressing their gratitude. I think that's a really amazing achievement at 15 years old. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it was a very empowering experience as an adolescent. We heard about Amnesty International because Peter McPhee, a historian who was then a PhD student at Melbourne and ended his sort of formal working life as provost at Melbourne Uni, was then the secretary of the Victorian branch newly formed of Amnesty International, which was a pretty new organisation. So this is 1970, and a group of us were really struck by the power of the idea of working in a non-partisan way for human rights for people who were prisoners of conscience around the world, who had been imprisoned only because of their beliefs and not because they'd used or advocated violence or done anything criminal. And there was scepticism amongst the Victorian committee about whether, a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds could be trusted with that responsibility and communicating responsibly and politely to government officials on behalf of somebody. Peter managed to convince them, I think, that we should give it a go. And that was really encouraging to have that support. So we established this group, and this young man, Dimitrios Stavrakakis, who was 18, had been imprisoned at the time of a military regime in Greece for writing a political slogan on a wall near his home. And we tried lots of things on his behalf, writing to Greek government officials, writing to Australian officials to raise this issue with their Greek counterparts, trying to get publicity for his case amongst the Greek community in Melbourne, which after all was the then largest diaspora Greek community outside Athens. Melbourne was the next largest Greek city after Athens at that time. So Neos Kosmos, which had its editorial offices in Lonsdale Street, was, we went there after school. We did whatever we could think of. We raised money and sent it to his family. So he was released, and one will never know exactly what our contribution was to that. But clearly we were pleased. Whatever we had done, it obviously didn't hurt. His family, poor farmers in Crete, were enormously grateful for the support for them and for their son. So that was a really empowering experience as an adolescent, and particularly, I guess, the idea that a universal shared human value, human rights, could be the basis for making an effective intervention on the other side of the world and benefit the lives of somebody you'd never met, was pretty empowering. I guess around the same time, I got involved at the sort of tail end of the very large and widespread protest movement in Australia, seeking to end Australia's involvement in the war in Vietnam. And there really felt very powerfully two things. One is the power of organised people, working together for a common goal in large numbers. But also I was touched by the courage of the draft resistors in particular, and through an older cousin got to know a number of them. At that stage, young Australians may not now be aware, but at the time of the Vietnam War there was compulsory conscription based on the lottery of your birth date. There was literally a lottery, and if you were unlucky enough for your birthday within the eligible age range to fall on certain days, then you were drafted and could be sent to Vietnam. So a number of my people that I got to know through my older cousin had taken the courageous decision not just to try and be conscientious objectors, to personally try and exclude themselves from conscription, but took the more radical position of resisting the whole idea of being drafted, not just seeking a personal exemption for themselves.
Everyone who wanted to accept.
So they took some risks. The Commonwealth Police were looking for those people. They risked jail. Some of them gave away all of their possessions because otherwise they could be confiscated. It was a courageous thing to do. And I guess seeing that combination of people working together being able to change national policy and the particular role that courageous individual could play in walking the talk and living their values was I guess those were pretty empowering for me. And I remember a letter that my father wrote. He was a fairly sort of stern guy at that time. He didn't particularly support those engagements, but he allowed me to be involved in those things. And in the first Vietnam moratorium that I joined, I think in 1970, he wrote a letter to the principal, which I'm eternally grateful for, and actually was actually quite important because he wrote to the principal and he said, I don't necessarily agree with Tilman on this, but he feels very strongly about it, and I'd be grateful if you could let him have the day off school so that he could join the Vietnam moratorium march, which was so the principal said, sure. So that was nice to have that encouragement to sort of act on your beliefs. So those were two certainly important experiences for me growing up in the outer suburbs of Melbourne in 1970.
Did you ever get in trouble with your activism activities?
Not really. No serious personal risk or disadvantage. I guess I was lucky in some ways because I was sort of bright, I was sort of able academically. I could get good marks, I had a good memory, and I could regurgitate things pretty well. I was kind of protected. I remember at one point being threatened with expulsion by the principal on an issue which might sound rather trivial, but became a sort of a lightning rod for me about kind of undue restrictions and kind of personal choice, which was about my hair length. I mean, it's a pretty trivial thing really in the scheme of things, but the principal said, your hair is much longer than the school regulations allow, and you've accepted those regulations, you really should either accept them or leave the school. And I sort of was trying to make a point, I guess, and thought that because I was usually Dux of the Year, he was probably unlikely to expel me. So I sort of made a political calculation that I could stretch it a bit further than maybe somebody else in a less secure position academically could. But no, look, it's small. And I didn't get expelled, and I didn't cut my hair either. So
worked out.
But no, look, I at times you feel nervous, and not so much for yourself, but for your family, and particularly for children. And certainly when I first went to French Polynesia, At the time, the French nuclear testing program was still underway, and we were very actively working against it. And I came to the attention of the French government, and they were not happy with some of the work that I was doing. In particular, I wrote a paper which was eventually published in The Lancet, which documented that outbreaks of a sort of an ecological toxin disease called ciguatera, common in tropical reef areas worldwide in any case. There were explosive outbreaks and major epidemics related to the military construction activities and the nuclear testing program in French Polynesia, at a time when the French government was consistently arguing that its nuclear test program had no demonstrated proven adverse health or environmental impacts and therefore was safe. I know that at the highest levels of the French government they were very annoyed with this paper because it was published in The Lancet, the world's most prestigious, largest circulation medical journal. It got lots of media coverage, and it proved that there was a health and environmental impact of their tests. They didn't like it. But then when I went there and, was very thoroughly searched by French police on arrival and departure, and, in those days, the Australian government too would clearly tap phones, and you could quite easily tell when your phone was tapped because there were sort of clicks at the start and at the end of calls. And I mean, amongst most of my friends and colleagues at that time involved in sort of activism of various sorts, you presumed that you were being monitored, and ASIO did then monitor many thousands of people involved in all sorts of entirely legitimate protest and civil society activities at that time. I've never bothered to check my ASIO records, but I'd be disappointed if I didn't have one. So particularly when the French government bombed the Rainbow Warrior and killed people in New Zealand who were about to visit the test zone, Greenpeace activists, and you realise that governments are prepared to go to some pretty brutal lengths to try and silence opposition, that you're aware that there are personal risks involved in some of the work. For me, the awareness that I was in a relatively low risk environment and had the means and capacity and could make choices in my life to do this kind of work, working for the elimination of nuclear weapons, heightened the sense of responsibility that I should, particularly also on behalf of people who couldn't. Within IPPNW, within the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, there were people whose well-being was threatened at times, and the leaders of our affiliate in Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was still in power, were killed. No doubt in part because of their IPPNW work. So, some people in difficult political environments, people who did the same work that I was part of, took great personal risks. So I didn't incur those same risks, and for me that heightened the sense of responsibility that I needed to do what was relatively easy and safe for me to do, but much harder for people in more difficult situations.
That's a really interesting play in a way, leveraging what you know to be the relatively safe environment of being based in Australia, as opposed to a more dangerous situation such as in Iraq or in the, I presume, Middle East or somewhere around those lines.
Well, even in the Pacific, I mean, another situation was where Palau, a very small Pacific island country, which actually this year was the first Pacific island nation to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, was negotiating a compact of free association with the United States and developing a constitution in which it clearly sought to enshrine freedom from nuclear weapons. Palau's a tiny place, 35,000 people roughly, and the US was essentially bludgeoning them in very blunt terms, to vote on an agreement that didn't preclude or restrict US military use of those islands. People were threatened. A lawyer called Roman Bador, his father was killed by some anonymous assassin. Palau voted, I think in the end 11 times, forced by the US to vote again and again until they voted a compact that was agreeable to the United States. So small states can get, pushed around very roughly by great powers. So it's not just places of obvious ongoing conflict, but even relatively parts of the world that you would assume would be relatively benign. Nowhere's immune from, unfortunately, from intimidation and political violence. So
a lot of what I'm getting is that a lot of lives were behind the one Nobel Peace Prize. A lot of lives were actually lost, and a lot more were threatened.
Sure, not in huge numbers, I guess, but this kind of work takes considerable courage, and for me, the fact that I, at multiple levels, have the means, happen to be born into an environment where I didn't need to go hungry, didn't need to worry where my next meal was coming from, was able to be educated, could make choices, could live comfortably, a very privileged position in global terms, being able to become a physician, involves several levels of responsibility. And Albert Einstein said those who know have the responsibility to act. And also from a medical point of view, the fact that if the World Health Organization has identified nuclear weapons as the greatest immediate threat to human health and welfare, which it has, then there's a professional, ethical responsibility to engage with that issue. And the fact that I am in a position to do that, and more easily than other people who aren't, for either capacity, poverty, difficult life circumstances, or difficult political environments, or whatever reason, is a very powerful additional motive for me. I have the choices. I'm in a very privileged position, so I should do what I can, also on behalf of those for whom it's much harder.
It's that self-awareness which drives you to unlock your full potential in terms of what impact you can make.
And the Nobel Prize is a huge recognition. Of course, it's an extraordinarily humbling honour. But I think the fact that this work, particularly in this I mean the health evidence-based advocacy for a world free of nuclear weapons as a planetary health imperative, and a very urgent one, being recognised in recent times in 2 Nobel Peace Prizes, in the one awarded to international physicians for the prevention of nuclear war in 1985, and again now through ICANN indirectly, in that ICANN was founded by IPPNW, founded by the Medical Association for Prevention of War, the IPPNW affiliate in Australia, really as kind of our outreach vehicle, because somebody needs to take responsibility for the nuts and bolts of a campaign coalition. Campaign coalition sounds all fine and nice, lots of organisations working together for a very specific purpose with a clear mandate that is agreed by all. But it can easily end up that if nobody takes responsibility for the nuts and bolts of hosting the thing, of employing the staff, of raising the funds, of running the bank accounts, of staying on the right side of the law, of setting up an office, then it can easily fizzle. So that hosting, nurturing, founding function was performed by IPPNW, on the basis of disarmament being stuck and a new initiative being needed, but also the inspiration provided by the international campaign to ban landmines, which was a remarkable treaty-focused civil society campaign coalition based on the unacceptable humanitarian impacts of landmines. That was very much the model for ICANN. And the citations for both Nobel Peace Prizes, to IPPNW and to ICANN, have considerable similarity. IPPNW's was in recognition of their disseminating authoritative information about the real consequences of nuclear war, doing so to public and decision makers across the world, particularly then on both sides of the very bitter Cold War divide, and of thereby giving disarmament negotiations new impulse, new energy, new urgency. And the citation for last year's prize for ICANN is very similar. It was for spreading authoritative information about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, and for its role in this groundbreaking treaty that for the first time provides a legal prohibition on the worst of all weapons. So I think from both of those, one should take enormous encouragement at just how important a role health evidence-based advocacy can play on this most urgent of existential global threats.
Let's switch for a second from your nuclear advocacy to your medical career. Originally, you chose science in Monash and then switched around to medical school. How's did that all come around?
First, just let me say that I just make a slight point about the framing of your question. Mm-hmm. For me, the work that I do, working for a world free of nuclear weapons, is medical work. My medical work is not separate. This is medical.
Got it. Sorry.
It's the most important medical work I do, I think.
Got it.
And certainly the most rewarding. But how did I end up in medicine? What else did I do in medicine, I guess, is where you're headed. I always had broad interests. I would have been just as happy studying literature and continuing art as I was doing, 2 maths, chemistry and physics in year 12. I guess I was susceptible to that then more general pressure that if, as a boy, if you could, you kind of headed towards the sciences, the physical sciences, and then I didn't really have a clear vision of what I wanted to do at uni, so I started doing science, but 2 years in, heading towards biological sciences and thinking about sustainable agriculture is probably the most useful area that I might use biological science background for. Really kind of was struck that I don't really have a clear sense enough of what I'm here for and what I'm doing, and was sort of drifting a little bit. So I decided to take a year away from study and had a fantastic year travelling. Spent 4 months in Japan, a couple of months in the Philippines. Wonderful experiences. Then came back and paid off debts, worked in factories and on the roads, labouring jobs, and then really wasn't sure what to do, but wanted to do something that made use of my science background but was a little more directly connected with people. My then girlfriend, now my wife, had just started medicine in that year, also having switched from science at the end of first year, and switched to medicine and absolutely loved it and thought that it would be good for me, and convinced me that I should apply. And then a wonderful anatomy professor, Eric Glasgow, who anybody of that vintage at Monash will remember well and probably very fondly, I think was sort of convinced that I had pretty serious motivation, and I think helped me to get in. So that's how I ended up in medicine. And then I would have been happy doing lots of things. I was not one of these people who, only ever wanted to be a neurosurgeon and nothing else would have been good enough. But I would have been happy doing lots of different things. I thought I'd do paediatrics, but then I sort of got interested and encouraged in adult medicine, did a bit more than I would have been the minimal pathway to paediatrics, and then my daughter came along, so that was a pretty good substitute for peds in some ways, becoming a parent. So then I continued in adult medicine and was drawn to infectious diseases because it intrinsically has so much ecology within it. You know, the interface between bugs and people and environments is fascinating and constantly changing and intrinsically global, and as all medicine is really. But the aspects of prevention are so obvious in infectious diseases, with immunisation in particular. And it's a very eclectic specialty, you know, people of all ages with all kinds of diseases in all kinds of systems come under ID care. So it seemed an interesting area with lots of bits of prevention and public health sort of intrinsic to it, as well as broad kind of ecological aspects. So that kind of interested me, and then I was drawn to travel medicine, really, which was sort of a new area in terms of a kind of a subspecialty interest. There seemed to be a real need for it. I was particularly interested in keeping humanitarian and development workers healthy, so worked as the first medical advisor for the Overseas Service Bureau, which ran the Australian Volunteers Abroad program, and then after a number of years moved to Australian Red Cross in a similar role. So that's been my clinical focus. Vaccines have been a really major love of my life, I'd have to say, and I got involved through the good graces of Ian Gust, who founded the virus lab at Fairfield, and when he left Fairfield to become Research and Development Director at CSL, involved Bev Biggs and I in 2 projects in Thailand and Indonesia that he was the lead person in the International Task Force for Hepatitis B immunisation for. So he kind of introduced me to global public health and got me involved in an extraordinary series of projects in Indonesia, introducing and evaluating hepatitis B vaccine, showing how it could be delivered safely and effectively to newborn infants in the home through outreach visits and community-based birth notification, how that could be bundled with a whole range of time-sensitive interventions for the postnatal mother and her in the early newborn period for the baby. A whole lot of influences on national policy in Indonesia. And so I've dealt with vaccines in a whole range of spheres, in travel medicine, in public health programs, had a similar role in the Pacific, supporting the Australian and New Zealand government aid programs and UNICEF and WHO for about a 15-year period in national immunisation program support in Pacific Island countries, and still serve on a WHO regional hepatitis B control committee. So, and then I spent a number of years in the vaccine industry as medical director for vaccines for one of the largest manufacturers, where I really not only got to see much more and be involved in vaccine development at a very exciting time when vaccines were the major clinical development programs for rotavirus vaccine, pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, malaria vaccine, HPV vaccines, were all in full flight. It was an extraordinarily fertile time in vaccines. This is late 90s, early 2000s. So I did that for 5 years. And I'm constantly struck by the power of prevention and how much can be accomplished with relatively meagre resources with such wonderful tools as vaccines on a very equitable basis globally. So those have been the other areas that I've worked in, but really for me, while I've enjoyed that enormously, really my working for the abolition of nuclear weapons has really been my main professional and personal calling, and for me has been the most rewarding and also the most important work I think I could be doing. So that's now become, 80% plus of my time these days.
I think what I can surmise is that all of it is about the magic of prevention and how, in a way, if I've got this correct, the abolition of nuclear weapons is the ultimate form of prevention. Because if you look at vaccines, it's diseases, but human health that is at stake. But with nuclear weapons, there's more than that. There's lives.
It's the future. It's the whole future. It's Eric Schlosser, who's a very thoughtful journalist writer, has written remarkably insightful work about nuclear weapons. But something that he said, I think, keeps resonating with me, which is that we really, and this is obviously a bit of an oversimplification, but there's an enormous amount of truth in it, that we really face two existential threats of human origin that could really, that not just threaten individual health, but the very continuity of our species, of healthy ecosystems that sustain complex life. One is global climate disruption, and the other is nuclear weapons. Climate disruption, extinction threat and other thresholds notwithstanding, is essentially a slower process and at least significantly reversible. Nuclear war would be sudden and mostly irreversible. And everything that human civilization and people have strived for, have built, have passed down through generations, all that extraordinary knowledge, architecture, culture, music, literature, everything that we strive for in every sphere of human activity is jeopardized, could become tragically irrelevant if nuclear weapons are used. So it's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of absolute necessity that they be eliminated before they can be used again. And if they are retained, they will indefinitely at some point be used again. So we're really in a race against time. And so for me, whatever sphere of life one works in, whatever one's aspirations and skills are, this is something we should take personally. This is business for all of us. We all have a crucial interest and an important role to play in making sure that these humans have never before had the capacity to cause such severe disruption that they could actually jeopardise the continuity of life. And we now can do that through environmental means and climate disruption, as well as through nuclear weapons. So these are unprecedented challenges, which no human previous generations in all our long evolution has ever had to grapple with, which is pretty daunting and which is a very sobering and serious burden and responsibility. But the flip side of that is that this is an extraordinary opportunity. We literally, all of us alive now, have the opportunity to kind of save the world. And what better thing could you possibly want to contribute to? So in that sobering imperative is great opportunity and hope. The capacity to do good in addressing those two threats. If we can get rid of nuclear weapons, and there's so many important things still to do, but it creates the space, the opportunity, the time. Jonathan Schell talked about the gift of time. those other things will still be there. All of those other things, those other huge challenges. But the existential nature of these threats means that they need to be addressed in a way that we don't have a choice about, and it's an absolute requirement for continued health and survival that we manage to get rid of nuclear weapons before they get rid of us.
I guess you can't be too dismayed, as the very recent Nobel Peace Prize as a large landmark step in that direction.
It's a deeply humbling honour and a very wonderful thing. It's important for a number of respects. I think it's draws attention to the urgency of the issue at a time when there's lots of distraction and not enough focus on the urgency of getting rid of nuclear weapons, and not enough people are giving this their best attention. So it certainly helps in that regard. It also recognises the significance of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons that was adopted last year and is well on the way to entering into force, which is a treaty of historic significance, which is opposed by the nuclear-armed and nuclear-dependent states. So the 9 nuclear-armed states, the 28 member states of NATO, as well as Japan, South Korea and Australia, the countries that claim protection from US nuclear weapons, do not support this treaty and have in fact repudiated it. But it's of historic significance. So particularly because it has some powerful naysayers recognising the importance of the treaty is significant. It also gives enormous recognition but encouragement to people in civil society and to governments to continue the work towards elimination of nuclear weapons, to use the treaty to advance that goal. So it is a very significant development, and I hope that as the first, and I'm certainly experiencing that as the first Nobel Peace Prize born in Australia, I want everyone in Australia to feel some sense of pride and ownership, and to be reminded how much can be achieved by a few ordinary people, with a vision, with a plan, and with persistence. So I hope whatever causes people care about, they will take encouragement from the remarkable story of how the 3 of us in Melbourne planned a campaign that took off globally and became the major partner for governments, and was crucial in getting this historic treaty for the first time categorically and comprehensively prohibiting nuclear weapons over the line by an overwhelming majority of nations at the United Nations. That whatever cause you're involved in, you should take encouragement from that. And one of the lovely things about it is that the prize was not awarded to any particular individuals, but to the whole campaign. So what we've been doing very deliberately with the medal that we have in Australia, the replica that the Nobel Committee kindly provided, is sharing it as widely as possible. And when you see, blackfellas who are on contaminated country in South Australia from the British nuclear tests, who've been trying to grapple with that legacy, so pleased to share the medal. People who've worked on that nuclear testing program, suffering ill health as a long-term legacy, people who've worked for this campaign in a whole range of capacities around the country, the excitement that people have to share this thing. It's a wonderful way to celebrate what people have achieved and can achieve.
We'll wrap up with 2 questions. First is, if you could have a gigantic billboard anywhere with anything on it, metaphorically speaking, getting a message out there to millions or billions, what would it say?
I haven't thought about this before, so this obviously needs a lot of very careful thought, and sometimes the shortest things are need the most thought. But what I'm finishing a lot of my talks with at the moment is the very simple question that we put as the part of the title of a commentary piece in the New England Journal of Medicine earlier this year that I co-wrote with a Boston-based physician colleague, Setsuko Thurlow, the Hiroshima survivor who co-accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICANN, where we asked, will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? It will be one of those two things. And we all can play a role in making sure that the answer to that question, which is not predetermined, is the right one. So at this point, my first draft would be, will it be the end of nuclear weapons or the end of us? You decide.
And the second question is, what advice do you think medical students are given too much that they should ignore?
That's a difficult question, Jefferson. In my interactions with medical students, which is mostly in a teaching context, there's a huge pressure to sort of absorb and learn, a vast amount of material in a very short space of time. There's also much more than there was in my period, great concern about the sort of competitive treadmill, if you like, that people are feeling the need at least to sort of plan ahead. They're already thinking about internship when they're in third year medicine, and trying to get their CVs in order and putting in applications and figuring out. And there seems to be a lot more sort of formalised competitive pressure. And one of the things I do is I've been helping to coordinate the intercalated MD-MPH program. That is a terrific program that enables students to graduate with MD and MPH with only one extra year for a degree MPH that would normally take 2. So it's a terrific deal. But lots of people, the main reason why they don't want to do it is simply the extra year that it takes, and the potential disadvantage that puts them in relation to colleagues, and from a time pressure point of view. So I think in medicine it's possible to find a path to make a great contribution and to build a rewarding career in so many different fields. Sometimes it takes time to find that. People shouldn't be shy about making mistakes, about trying something, about defining their path in an evolving way, and not necessarily feeling that they have to lock their plans in early, in a very defined sort of competitive driven pathway. I think the opportunity to explore, I didn't plan most of the things that I've become involved with. I was open to opportunities. I had good teachers and mentors. I took opportunities that were given to me, and then on the basis of initial experience and support, you run with it. Don't underestimate the value of being open and flexible and running with opportunities, and don't be too worried about competitive pressures and timelines and needing to bed everything down well in advance. Would certainly be, at a practical level, something I'd want to convey to medical students today.
I think that's some very great advice, as well as very imperative message that nuclear weapons are a much greater threat than most of us realise. We want to thank you for taking the time to speak with the Eternal Possibilities viewers, and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jefferson.